He is an instructor down at Oregon State University. He has his bachelor's from Rice University in 1982. Just talked to him recently. He then had a career in music for about 20 years before he decided to go back to college, go back to school, get his master's, got his master's in ecology from Evergreen in about 2007, and went on, got a PhD from OSU in 2013 or 14. Yeah. And he still dabbles in music. He still plays. He has a couple of bands, I guess, he plays with in the Corvallis area, so you might look him up. And maybe he'll play something sing something for us, right? So his work is focused primarily on the ecology of animal and plant interactions, including, or particularly, trophic cascades effects involving large herbivores and top predators. He has shown that wolf reintroduction in Yellowstone had been a catalyst for aspen recovery, both outside and inside the park boundaries. So let's welcome Luke.
Thank you for having me. This is a real privilege to be here, and what a beautiful campus. And I feel very honored, although somewhat humbled, because they actually asked my former advisor at OSU to do this talk first. And then he recommended me. But thank you for having me. Yeah, as John said, I've done research in Yellowstone on trophic cascades, and when I was invited to do this talk about Keystone species, I thought, well, that's right up my alley, and so I'm really excited to share this with you. And I thought, well, how deep do I want to go on this? And I thought, well, these people like science, so a little science is probably going to be okay. Here's some terminology, some graphs. And my subtitle is Predators in the Web of Life, because this really is about the web, how everything is all connected. And animal species are not just separate things in the world. They're all interacting, animals and plants. And so I'm gonna throw a few terms out there at you in the course of this talk. Keystone species, indirect effects, and trophic cascades. Trophic cascades are an example of indirect effects of predators. Top down or bottom up is a term you hear thrown around a lot, how ecosystems are structured. And compensatory or additive predation, something most people don't think about, but predation isn't always something that limits the prey populations. And then some ideas about ecosystem complexity, such as subsidized predation and other aspects of ecosystem complexity and how that all plays into this. So we'll run across these concepts. And when I started putting this together, I realized, I don't even really know what a keystone is. I've been using this terminology for decades. I knew it was some kind of important stone, like I guess I thought about a cornerstone, right? So a keystone is the top stone in an arch. And so when this was chosen to represent the keystone species concept, the idea was that it's at the top of this whole food system. And this was originally introduced by Robert Payne in 1966 and 1969 publications. And he did an experiment with purple sea stars, which you've probably seen when you go down to the coast and look at tide pools. And they are predators of mussels and other things that attach to the rocks in the tide pools. And so he isolated some tide pools and he removed the predators to see what would happen. And removing starfish actually resulted in less biodiversity in the tide pools because one species of mussel would end up taking over the whole area. And so this would crowd out other mussels and similar things that would attach to the rocks. And so he thought this was pretty profound. And so he coined this term, a keystone species, to describe the sea stars in this ecosystem. And he had basically two parts of it. One was that it was a species of high trophic level. And trophic is a term that means energy and how energy moves through ecosystems. And so a high trophic level, this refers to the way we think about, we kind of image ecosystems where the plants are on the bottom, and then you've got the things that eat the plants in the middle of the trophic levels. These are called trophic levels. And then the predators are at the top, so they're high trophic levels. So he's saying, well, this is something that's at a high trophic level. It's a predator. and it has a disproportionate influence on species diversity, by which he meant it had a strong effect relative to its abundance. So you wouldn't have as many sea stars or starfish in there as you would all these other things, but they had a big influence on what was going on in the ecosystem. So this was his idea of a keystone species. Well, over time, this grew into a broader concept. And so people started talking about other species that have a big effect on the ecosystems, even if they weren't predators. A prime example being beavers, as I say, changing the world one dam at a time. I mean, they make a huge influence on their ecology around them, affecting all the other species that use those streams by developing wetlands. Like this looks like a pretty dry environment here, but they've created this pond, these willows are growing, they've expanded the habitat for willows, ducks come and use these ponds, you can get fish in there. So they have a huge effect on ecosystems. And so people started, well, they're keystone species, aren't they? They're not predators, but they have a big effect. And then it expanded even further. There was a paper that called bison a keystone species. Well, they actually are present in large numbers, and they're not predators, so they don't fit either of Payne's original ideas. But they do have a big effect on their ecosystem by suppressing shrubs and by foraging on certain plants and not others, by creating wallows and trampling. They have a big effect. So some people started applying it to them. And some of us that want to keep maybe be a little bit more clear about these things, use the term ecological engineers for some of these animals that aren't predators and that shape their habitat. So these became overlapping terms. So the keystone term kind of got a little away from its original definition, but it's still useful. It conveys the idea that some species have a big effect on the world around them. That's basically what it means. But I'm going to focus on the rest of this talk on the predator idea and kind of bring it back to the idea of wolves and how they operate as a keystone species, which is where a lot of my research has been. But first, an example about one of the most famous examples of a keystone species that actually led to the term Trophic Cascades was sea otters. And this was discovered in the early 70s, a paper in 1974 that talked about this Trophic Cascades. And so sea otters, in a simplified version of their food web, they feed on sea urchins, and sea urchins eat kelp. And so these researchers discovered that where sea otters had been, were absent, that the sea urchins were very prevalent, and they were eating all the kelp, like even the little growing kelp, and so that this wiped out the kelp forest. A kelp forest, I don't know if you know what a kelp forest is, but you see the kelp beds out there where it's floating on the surface. That goes all the way down to the bottom. And this is the prime habitat for a lot of fish and sea otters. That's what sea otters need. And so sea otters were actually helping to maintain their own habitat by eating the sea urchins. And so this was the discovery that led to this whole idea about trophic cascades, and of course building on the work with the starfish. And here's a paper that came out later showing a year here on the bottom scale, but you don't really need to worry about that. The point is that they had some in this one place, they had a time where sea otters were very abundant, and then the sea otters decreased. And they found that when this happened, the sea urchins increased a lot. That's this middle graph where you went from hardly any to a big bar here indicating a lot of sea urchins. And then the kelp, which was a big bar back in the early period, went down to a very small amount of kelp. So they saw this happen in reverse where sea otters declined. I'll come back to this because they were making a bigger point about why did the sea urchins decrease in this area, and we'll come back and look at that a little later. But so this is a famous 3-level trophic cascade where you got the sea otters, the sea urchins that they eat, and the kelp that the sea urchins eat, and the sea otters are indirectly affecting the kelp by reducing the sea urchins. A really interesting case. And of course, we're trying to get sea otters reintroduced right out here in Oregon. They did it in the 70s, and it failed. They either died or went back north. But there's an effort going on right now that looks like it's going to happen to try to reintroduce sea otters in Oregon, where they were wiped out originally by fur trade, because their fur is so fine. They have the best fur ever, so they were worth a lot of money. And so, predators have had a bad rap, especially wolves. You know, they're always the villains. There's Little Red Riding Hood. You know, I don't know how she thought that was her grandma, but there she is. And of course, they were persecuted not only for their furs, but because people consider them competition. I mean, they're big trouble, right? They go after your cows and your sheep. That's the classic thing, the wolf in sheep's clothing, right? They're always getting the sheep, okay? Sheep can't really defend themselves. One of my scientist friends says that sheep are like M&Ms for wolves. And so, you know, they've always been persecuted. And I like this one from the World War II era. He's got the Nazi armband on. He's going to break down the door of the Three Little Pigs. So, you know, they've been the villains. And I mean, there's some logic to that, right? People have had to deal with this for a long time. Well, these days there's more of a move to try to accept predators, an increasing tolerance. And maybe this partly goes along with just the fewer of us actually depend on raising sheep and cows, and we have jobs and things like that, so we can afford to think about other things in a different way. But it's also part of the recognition of the ecosystem concept, which really emerged in the 20th century with people like Aldo Leopold advocating that we stop just automatically killing the predators, keep all the parts of the ecosystem, because we need them all to make everything work. And that's part of where that Keystone species idea comes in, the Trophic Cascade comes in. These predators are doing more than just eating things. They're influencing the whole ecosystem, and these are services that are important to us. The way things work in nature is important to us. So this kind of growing awareness made people think, we need to try to save these pieces, and that led to a little bit more of acceptance of the idea of having predators around, and plus, you know, more romantic ideas about wildness. I grew up as a kid just, you know, dreaming about going out in the wilderness and loving animals. I would get magazines and cut out little pictures of animals and put them all over my room. You know, that's probably because I didn't grow up on a farm, right? My grandmother grew up on a farm and she didn't get it, you know. She was happy being in her living room with her TV. I mean, she had enough of that. But I was really, really excited about it. This is probably why I'm here today. And so this led to the idea of having sustainable management instead of trying to exterminate everything. And with that, we're definitely going to have some conflicts, right? I mean, if we're going to keep the animals around, we're going to have to learn how to live with them instead of getting rid of them, and we're going to have some conflicts. And public opinion is strongly divided about whether we want to deal with that or not. And so here's an example of this top banner here. This is a website from a cattle Ranchers Association in Oregon, where they have a video, you know, about their perspective on wolves. And I have my students watch this, and then they also watch some other perspectives. But, you know, there's the wolf, like he's a little snarly, he's got blood on his teeth, and there's little Bambi right in front of him, and the pet, the cows, the helpless cows, and the little kid, and the elk, everything that's threatened by the evil wolf, and private property rights, right? Because the federal government and the state government is going to come in here and tell you what you can and can't do on your property. Right, so they're really worried about the wolves. And this here is a sign that a friend of mine took a picture of. This was in a store window in Idaho after they reintroduced wolves in Idaho. You know, I don't know if I can say that out loud, but kill all the wolves and the people who put them here. You know, there's just like a lot of anger about it. And what we have here is a hearing that happened, a public hearing that happened before the wolves were introduced in Yellowstone. And there was a lot of public protests. People were saying this is a railroad job. I like the one in the middle. Yellowstone was never home to the wolf. Well, maybe in that person's lifetime it was never home to the wolf, right? But it certainly was before that. But people were angry about it, and they were afraid that this was going to cause some problems for them. And plus, they just don't like the idea of the federal government doing anything that's going to impact their lives. Now, the reason the federal government did introduce wolves in Yellowstone, I mean, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is well aware of the pushback, but they waited a long time after wolves were listed on the Endangered Species Act in the 70s, hoping they would get back from Canada, right? But and some wolves would occasionally get into Wyoming and into Yellowstone, but in that area around there, but they would either get hit by cars or they'd get shot, or they didn't find a mate, so they just never got going. So they finally decided we're going to have to kind of set it going ourselves if this is going to work. And it did work. It was successful. And this is another website from the Defenders of Wildlife, which are totally against any killing of wolves. They're totally support advocating for wolves, and you can even pay $150 and sponsor your own wolf pack. And this is to fight anti-wolf extremism. And of course, everybody loves a puppy, right? I mean, he's not going to do anything bad. He just looks so cute. So you can see how this is going to be a problem with the different public points of view. And the Defenders of Wildlife, to their credit, they've done a lot of work trying to get people to adopt non-lethal management methods. They put a lot of volunteer effort into this. They have programs to help people implement non-lethal deterrents to wolves, including range riders. Although, frankly, that guy looks like an actor pretending to be a cowboy to me. And maybe they couldn't find a real cowboy that would be in their picture. I don't. But so you can see the kind of conflicts we got going on there. So Trophic Cascades, though, this is appreciating wolves as a keystone species. And my mentor, Dr. Ripple, who I mentioned earlier, he had this article in Science Magazine where it's showing how the wolves, with the wolves kind of here at the top here as the keystone, then you have all these other species that are either affected directly, which are the strong arrows, or indirectly, which are the dashed arrows, by the reintroduction of wolves. And these things have all been demonstrated in research. Of course, the strength of the extent of these effects and to what degree they're due to changes in elk behavior or direct changes in numbers, that stuff is still debated. But these things are all happening. And the real key here is what we call browsing. Browsing is when herbivores eat the nice tender shoots of bushes, as opposed to grazing, which is like grazing on the grass on the ground. So browsing is eating the bushes and the trees, the woody plants, and they like to eat the tender shoots. And I took that picture in the parking lot of Mammoth at Yellowstone. I was just sitting in my car, and this elk came up and started munching on this bush. And so I just took a picture right there. And so that's what's happening here. The elk are browsing on the plants, the woody plants. The wolves are influencing the elk, and this is having indirect effects throughout the ecosystem, as well as effects on coyotes, which we call mesopredators. They're like the middle predators. Meso means in the middle. And their prey indirects there. And then on scavengers like bears and eagles and crows, they're feeding off of the kills of the wolves, and various other indirect effects. So these indirect effects can include plants and their habitats of animals, trees, shrubs, which support beavers. This can have a big effect on biodiversity and animals like the sapsucker here that depend on aspen, and then the scavengers, as I mentioned, and the mesopredators, which also could include foxes, bobcats, and other things like that. Now, aspen and willow, which I studied in Yellowstone, these are important components of habitat diversity in the northern Rockies. The aspen is the only deciduous tree in many of these areas outside of cottonwoods, which only grow along the rivers. And then willows are frequently along the streams. That's normally what you would expect to see along the streams. And they stabilize the banks, they shade the streams, which helps fish. They support beavers, like you see this beaver pond right here, built out of willows. And as the climate becomes warmer and drier, these things are even more important as little oasis spots on the ecosystem. And they can be strongly affected by herbivory, and they were strongly affected by herbivory by elk. And so elk, numerous studies have shown that elk can outcompete beavers for willow, because the elk will eat the willows, but they can eat other things too. The beavers are totally dependent on the willows, and so if you get an grazing of elk in the area, and they're browsing on all these willows, and if they prevent the willows from growing tall enough for the beavers to use, then the beavers can't live there. And in fact, there's an interaction where when beavers cut willows, you've probably experienced this too if you ever cut willows in your property, they'll resprout, they'll grow right back, right? There's boom, they're growing back. But then they're short and they have all these tender shoots. And so if an elk or cows or something like that come along and eat that, they can prevent that from growing taller. So the combination of beavers and high numbers of elk can actually accelerate the removal of willows, and then the beavers can't make a living anymore. So you can lose the beavers. This is actually some returning beavers there in Yellowstone that I got a picture of. You can see little ducks using the pond. And here's Bill Ripple, who I mentioned earlier. This is a fence in Yellowstone. It's called an exclosure instead of an enclosure because it's intended to exclude animals from this area. And they put this in the 1950s when there was a lot of talk about how the elk were impacting the range. They wanted to see, well, what would happen if you kept the elk out of this spot? And there were some willows and aspen growing here. It's kind of a wet spot on the landscape. So they put this fence around this wet spot. And they're like, well, what would happen? Well, that's what happened. You got this huge growth of plants, of woody plants, willows and roses and aspen and berry bushes and stuff. And then bam, it stops right at the fence because the animals are eating them alongside the fence. And there's a trail that goes right there, so they have a lot of access. And so this really demonstrated the power that herbivores can have. Now, these plants wouldn't be growing up there in the sagebrush because they need some water, but they'd be out here where Bill is standing. And before they put the fence in, these plants didn't exist there. I mean, they were very short, and they still are in some places just right outside the fence. They just can't get going. So this demonstrated that a lot of times, I think this is something I learned doing this. Like I would go out to a landscape like this, and it would be all just, a prairie, and I would think, well, that's just how everything grows here. But no, it's actually a result of how things grow and the animals that are affecting those things that creates the situation that we observe there. And so herbivores can have powerful effects. Here's an aspen stand that has been trying to reproduce but can't. There's no young trees growing because the elk were eating all of the reproduction. And meanwhile, the older trees are getting old and they're dying out. And so there was actually concern that we were going to lose a lot of the aspen in northern Yellowstone where this was going on. So again, demonstrating that herbivores can have powerful effects. And this is a quote from 1958 from Yellowstone scientists. Former groves of aspen now have only a few trees which cannot be replaced while elk consume the reproduction. So this was the situation that we were studying after the wolves were introduced, and people didn't actually expect them to have much effect on this. So it was kind of surprising to see what was developing. And so in 2010, we were seeing some aspen stands that were really starting to take off. And you can see here the tall trees just like these, but now we have younger trees underneath there, and they're mostly about the same height. Well, why is that? That's because this stand used to look like this, and then it got a break. And the break was that the elk densities, the elk numbers went way down in this area after the wolves were reintroduced. And so now we see this new growth coming up underneath that's going to be able to replace these older trees so that this stand is going to persist on the landscape. Now, this didn't happen everywhere, and I've got a paper right now in process that's showing, about a third of the stands look like this now, and about a third of them still kind of look like this because we still have a lot of elk and also bison have increased and they're eating them. And then about a third of them are kind of in between. So that's a big difference over everything looking like this, like we had in the 1980s. And so that's what a lot of my work has focused on. We also see willows coming back in some places, and this is a place where in the early 2000s, we did a study here, and the willows were all, about this tall, and now they've taken off, and these willows now are, as tall as this screen, and there's actually a beaver pond right here. Beavers have repopulated the stream, so we're seeing some restoration effects in some places here in northern Yellowstone. Not everywhere, but some places are having some big restoration effects. And this also has a cascading effects on, for example, on birds. We've seen songbirds are using these willows. So this is going to affect the ecosystem. As I mentioned, shading the streams is good for fish. Plus, you got bugs living in the bushes, and the birds are eating the bugs are falling in the streams, the fish are eating the bugs. So, kind of the way you would expect things to work, right, is starting to work that way again. And so with wolves, the biodiversity restoration has begun in Yellowstone, and also Canada has more stable and lower densities of deer and elk and moose. So you don't see the problems like they're having out in the eastern U.S. where deer populations are really high now because protection of deer with hunting seasons and so forth was really successful. And now people are worried about them, eating the crops and hitting them with their cars. And so in places where you have the intact predator system, we see more stable and lower densities of deer, elk, and moose. And by more stable, I mean they're not hitting their starvation peaks and then crashing and going up and down like that. And it's important to remember that wolves don't do this all by themselves. Usually, for example, in Yellowstone, we have cougars and grizzly bears. But the cougars and grizzly bears, they weren't able to create this effect just with them. They needed the whole thing together. They needed the wolves back in there to really make this happen. And then the predation by the bears and the cougars is adding on to the effect of the wolves and creating this overall trophic cascade effect, which, as I said, is not universal. It doesn't happen everywhere that you have predators, and it's not uniform in Yellowstone. It's mixing on the landscape, which creates some heterogeneity. So this kind of brings me to this question about, so when do predators limit herbivores? And and really the question we want to ask is, what is limiting herbivores in any particular situation? Is it food or is it predators? And this is where those terms bottom up and top down come in. So bottom up, it describes a system where, remember that image of the plants on the bottom. So there, the forage base is what's determining the ecosystem. And so here you have high herbivore density, and the animals are limited by starvation. You might have heard that concept carrying capacity. And a lot of times people think, well, carrying capacity, that sounds good. Like that's how many animals you'd want, right? But if you think about it, carrying capacity means the animals have reached their limit of resources. So what's keeping them from increasing? They're starving, right? So that's the limit there. And so this is a situation that we call a bottom-up system. And in this kind of situation, predation is often what we call compensatory, which means that even though there's some predators, like there were cougars and bears eating elk, when the elk numbers were high, but they weren't really affecting the overall mortality of the elk, because a lot of elk were starving. Many elk were starving every winter. The cougars and bears, if they take some out, they're probably just reducing competition for the other ones, compensating. So that's why we call that compensatory predation. And that can be one situation. And then your indirect effects of predators are going to be weak or absent, because that's not what's really governing the situation. But top down is when you have a situation that's limited by predators, like I mentioned in Canada, the moose and the deer, elk, they tend to be more limited by predation. You have lower herbivore densities, which a lot of people might not like because they want to have lots of these prey animals around. But you have less starvation, they're in better condition. And this is because predation is additive. The predators are taking off enough animals that they're increasing the mortality and keeping the numbers down lower, away from that starvation limit. And so this is a situation where you can get reduction in the pressure of herbivores on plants in additive predation. And so this top-down limitation, this often occurs when you have multiple predators. Like I mentioned, the bears, the cougars, and the wolves. And almost everywhere that you have wolves, you have bears. Because wolves are usually the first ones to go when we persecuted them, and the last ones to come back. And so the bears are expanding more, and black bears too will eat elk calves and deer calves and things. And then cougars, they also have been extirpated from a lot of areas, but still they tend to come back before the wolves because they're sneaky. Right? So they're out, I mean, you don't know they're out there, but they're looking at you. Right? So they're getting out there before the wolves, and so wolves, like everybody sees them coming. They're the last ones to return. So generally where you have wolves, you have a multiple prey system, and that increases the ability of those predators to have top-down limitation on the prey. Now another thing that a lot of people don't think about that can result in predators being able to limit prey is what we call subsidized predation. This is when you have multiple prey sources. And what happens is, say you have a system with wolves and moose like they have on Isle Royale in Lake Michigan. Okay, it's just wolves and moose. Okay, so when the moose go down, the wolves go down too, because that's all they have to eat. But that's not usually how it works. Most places, wolves, for example, will have something else to eat too, like maybe deer or cows. They'll have something else to eat that they can do besides that target prey species, the moose. And so what this does is it keeps the predator populations up high, even while that one prey is being decreased, because they got other things to support them. And the classic example, if you look up subsidized predation on the internet, you will get only one example in most cases, which is cats and cat food. And so our outdoor cats, they have all the food they want. Their densities can be very high. Everybody's got one or two of them. And they can go out and hunt all day long, and it doesn't matter if they kill off all the prey, they're still going to have something to eat. And so this is a classic example of subsidized predation. But this happens in nature too, where animals have more than one thing to eat, the predators, then they can affect a prey species and keep it lower. And so this is another thing that can lead to top-down limitation. And so let's look at an example. So bottom up, we have the bison. They're mainly limited by forage. In Yellowstone, the wolves take a few bison, but they're really difficult. So mostly they try to focus on other things and maybe get one that's occasionally off by itself or is injured or something. And so predation is compensatory in bison. They're basically controlled bottom up by how much forage they have. And then you got moose in Canada and Alaska, where they're limited by wolves and human hunters and bears, but wolves arguably are having a big effect on the moose. So this is top down, the predation is additive, and they're keeping those moose populations lower, which is why people get upset about it in places where they depend on moose for their meat. Like in Alaska, they want to get rid of the wolves so they can have more moose to hunt. And so that can become controversial. Sometimes it has more to do with how recently there were fires, so there's a bunch of bushes to feed the moose, rather than how many predators there are. But still, those predators seem like they're taking something that we want, so it creates that conflict. But there you get a top-down situation, predation is additive. So it's not always additive. And so it depends on the situation, and you get different ecological consequences here in these cases. So in Yellowstone, the situation we had before wolves were introduced was that the herbivores, the elk in this case, the primary, the one that was in big numbers, they were at maximum capacity. They were being impacted by lots of starvation in the winter, and this caused them to just eat everything, whatever they could get. And so they were suppressing the plants with their browsing. Well, then when wolves were introduced and the elk population went down through a combination of effects with the wolves and other predators, as well as some human hunting outside the park, herbivores are reduced. Well, then the plants are released from this suppression and they're able to grow taller. So this, again, is a 3-level trophic cascade. And getting back to our otters. So what these people found, they were wondering, well, why are these otters decreasing? And what they found was that the orcas had started eating sea otters in this particular area in Alaska, where they had originally discovered the sea otter trophic cascade. Now the orcas are eating sea otters. And that's another big mystery, is why were they eating sea otters? Because sea otters don't have any blubber. You have to eat a lot of sea otters to get a meal if you're an orca. They want to eat seals and sea lions and things like that. And it would seem like there was some decrease in these other species, so they started preying on sea otters. They knocked the sea otters down, and this caused the sea urchins to increase and caused the kelp then to decrease. So they saw this reversing trophic cascade. So this is a 4-level trophic cascade. And so here you get a decrease in the plants because you've got a 4 levels instead of the 3 levels that caused an increase in the plants. Here's another interesting 4-level trophic cascade. So this was on an Aleutian island in Alaska where there were invasive rats. All these ships were going to the Aleutians lots of times. We had military bases and stuff, and rats really good at hiding on ships. And they got on this island, and so they would eat the seabird eggs and the baby birds, and the birds tended to eat these sea snails and mussels and things that live in the intertidal area, and those things eat the seaweed. So having the rats here, you have a 4-level trophic cascade that decreases the birds, increases the snails, which eat the seaweed, and the seaweed decreases. And then they got rid of the rats, and they found that then the seabirds increased, they ate more snails and things like that, and this allowed the seaweed to increase. So we had a 4-level turning into a 3-level trophic cascade by removing that invasive top predator, in this case, the rats. So another interesting example of how this can work, and it doesn't always work the same direction. Right? It depends on how many levels you got going on there. And so back to our image of Yellowstone, I mean, there's actually a lot of other things going on here. For example, the bears directly affect elk. They eat elk calves. And it turned out that Yellowstone cutthroat trout were being affected by lake trout. So the Yellowstone cutthroat trout are no longer running up the Yellowstone River like they used to spawn, which was a big feeding event for bears. And the bears then were switching over and eating more elk calves. So the lake trout actually were having an effect in here as well. And so that's an indirect effect of lake trout on elk. And then we got cougars, and of course cougars directly affect elk, and wolves affect cougars, and they interact. You know, wolves will chase them off of kills and things like that. And so you got some indirect effects there through the cougars. So I think the take-home message here, the trophic cascade, is just a little piece of a whole food web. And there's lots of different parts that are all interacting there, lots of moving parts going on. There's also predator-predator interactions. So for example, a study found that coyotes killed 34% less pronghorn fawns in areas with wolves. And that's because wolves tended to not kill the pronghorns, but they killed coyotes and chased them out. And that reduced the predation of coyotes on these pronghorn fawns. And also, wolves help foxes by suppressing coyotes. And this is a study that was also done at OSU by a friend of mine. And they have here fox abundance on the y-axis, and then wolf abundance here on the x-axis, and they found a relationship that where you had more wolves, you had more foxes. And that's because the wolves directly compete with and attack the coyotes, but they tend to leave the foxes alone. The coyotes tend to directly attack the foxes. So this caused wolves actually were helping the foxes. And they made this interesting hypothesis that wolves prey on deer that carry Lyme disease, the ticks that cause Lyme disease. So maybe wolves might actually decrease Lyme disease by eating deer, but also they suppress the coyotes and increase foxes. The foxes eat the mice that carry the ticks as well. So maybe there could be two ways here that wolves could help to decrease Lyme disease, by helping foxes and by also directly reducing the deer population. We haven't really confirmed this, but it's an interesting trophic cascade hypothesis. So do wolves further reduce Lyme disease by helping foxes? And they called this, I wanted to go back, they called this a cascade among carnivores, that the wolves, by suppressing the coyotes, were then helping the foxes. And so, some of the factors that can cause trophic cascades to be weak or to not happen are the complexity of the ecosystem. For example, having multiple herbivores like bison, some that are not limited by predators. And what's happened since the elk were reduced in northern Yellowstone, the bison increased, and they've actually taken over some of those effects in some areas. And I've got a couple of papers out about that. And then also, predators may not be at ecologically effective numbers in a lot of places because they don't get along with people, so we don't let them get to really high numbers and actually have those impacts. And humans have other influences on the ecosystems that might diffuse these effects. For example, in a lot of places, domestic livestock are the dominant herbivores, not wild animals. So if you've got sheep or cows that are eating all the willows, bringing in wolves there isn't going to help the willows because it's not their prey that's actually suppressing those plants. And a lot of times it's our own activities. So with large carnivores, you could have some problems. Conflicts with humans and their animals. Low prey densities, maybe lower than you would want, like for deer hunters. Predation of threatened species, like this woodland caribou. There's a subsidized predation thing going there where there's deer that the wolves are subsisting on. This is up in BC and northern Washington. But they still kill the woodland caribou. And so that's driving the woodland caribou down near extinction. And there's just unpredictable effects on what's going to happen when you put predators in a system. Some potential benefits You get lower densities of overabundant prey animals like deer that you're hitting with your cars and things like that, reduced crop damage. Fewer mesopredators like coyotes. Greater biodiversity and habitat diversity because you get animals like beavers coming back. And wildlife tourism benefits. I mean, this isn't something they didn't really know would happen when wolves were introduced in Yellowstone, but it is big business now to go to Yellowstone and see wolves. I mean, and you know, do tours around there. And so the people that used to be elk outfitters in northern Yellowstone border were upset because the elk populations went way down. But now we got this whole new crop of businesses that are taking people into the park to see the wolves. So you get some unexpected benefits there. So I think the take-home message here, you know, whether predators are good or bad kind of depends on what you want. And there's important goals and values on both sides of that argument. But removing or adding a predator can have complex and unpredictable consequences because everything is connected in the web of life. And that's really what the Trophic Cascade concept is about. So I'm going to stop there. I think I did pretty good on time. All right, thank you. All right, we got some questions over here. They're going to bring you a mic. Is that on? I know it is.
Okay. Yeah, I'm Dean. In one of your earlier slides, you had something in one of the categories about streams and morphic stream or something, and I was wondering how that played into the rest of the conversation, because you never mentioned anything about that.
Like how do Trophic Cascades affect streams?
Yeah.
Okay, so they can affect streams in a couple of ways. One is, like I mentioned, stream shading from the riparian vegetation, and also stabilizing of banks. We're seeing more erosion where the willows have been removed and the streams kind of tend to spread out or cut down. Erosion and shading, and then dropping more nutrient inputs into the streams from leaves and insects and things like that. These are, and plus beavers can then live in those areas. So various things that can affect streams.
Apex predators, though.
Yeah, because the apex predators are influencing the herbivores that eat the willows and allow the willows to grow on the banks of the streams in this Yellowstone Trophic Cascade. And so that's where we're seeing the effects on streams from the plants, that was the indirect effects of the predators. Yes, yes.
Up until my last visit to Yellowstone, my name's Mark, by the way, I didn't realize that the elk and the antelope and the deer have a migratory path. They don't actually stay in Yellowstone year round. They actually go down through Colorado quite a distance. Do the wolves, are they resident population, or do they follow that migration?
Okay, so that's a good question. So the mule deer and the pronghorn migrate out pretty long distances in some cases, like in south into Wyoming, like you're saying. The elk, they do an altitudinal migration, but they don't go very far. So there was a large herd of elk that we call the Northern Yellowstone elk herd. And they tended to be up in the mountains in the summer, and then they would come down in the big valleys in the winter. And that's where we were getting the big effects on the plants, as they're hanging out there in the winter and eating everything. So they don't have the long distance migrations like you're talking about. That's a good point.
Hi, I'm Virginia. One of the nature shows that I love to watch talked about how it's not just the predation of the wolves, but it is the disruption of the animals' feeding patterns, the prey's feeding patterns, and they actually had fewer calves. They had fewer, you know, the population went down because the wolves would bother them, basically.
Yeah.
And so, second question, if you can talk on that. But the second question is, I have reservations at a very large, expensive ranch in June to get into Yellowstone and Grand Teton. Is that too early to go?
In June?
Yeah, mid-June.
Well, you know, you're going to see a lot of animals in the early summer because they're still more down in the lower areas. But you're probably going to have more mosquitoes. Yeah, because it's wetter, you know. So I think that's early in the summer. There's still going to be snow in the high country, but I think you'll probably have some really interesting animal watching that'll be going, and you'll beat some of the other tourists there. So that'll be good. But about your first question, the behavioral Trophic Cascades effects, which I did not get into because I didn't really have time. There have been a lot of studies that have shown that elk have changed their behavior in various ways and at various scales in response to both wolves and cougars. But it's really hard to experimentally prove how much of that effect on plants comes from the changes in behavior. So we kind of infer that that's had some effect on where the elk go and how the plants are affected, but it's kind of overshadowed by the larger effect of their overall numbers coming down. And so it's hard to really pinpoint what exactly that effect that has on, on the overall trophic cascade. But there certainly is some effect. Elk are more vigilant. They might be more stressed out, like you were mentioning. They might be in smaller groups and avoid some areas and move to other areas. It's just, it's really hard to, in a huge natural system, to really pinpoint how much of that contributes to the overall trophic cascade effect. I think we had a question back here. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Rudy. A few years ago, I read a book that actually is the results of these studies. Is Ireland imported wolves because the deer populations were eating the sprouts and shrubberies, and it worked out. And if I remember right, there was some wolves that attacked livestock, and they segregated those individuals. So, and they really haven't had an issue with it. Do you know about that?
Yeah, so I do know in general about that. In Ireland and Scotland, there were some attempts to try to bring back predators to control the red deer, as they call them there, which is like our analog of the elk, because of these browsing effects. And but the question about controlling the livestock predation by segregating the ones that are attacking livestock, I mean, that can work, but it's hard to do on a large scale like Oregon. And one of the problems is that in the absence of these big predators, ranchers have changed how they do things from when they had a lot of predators around. And so they tend to just let the cows wander around on their own. And when cows die, they throw them in an open pit. And when we've been tracking wolves in those areas, we often see that they find those carcass pits. And this might be contributing to them learning to eat cows. Plus the cows are just standing there, they don't run very fast. So it's kind of likely that, they're going to try that out at some point. And if we had a finger on all of them, we probably could, try to grab those. And there have been attempts to remove packs that have started to do predation on cows. And so we're working on both sides of that angle. The managers are trying to help work with the ranchers to make sure they don't get access to dead cows and things like that, and that the cows have maybe more people watching. We call these range riders, keeping tabs on them. At the same time, when the wolves are getting into trouble, if they consistently prey on livestock, they will tend to lethally remove those wolves or that pack even. But this can cause more trouble, though, because if you remove the dominant individuals, the pack breaks up. And then you get young, inexperienced wolves running around, and they actually can do more trouble. So there's social structure issues as well that have to be taken into consideration with that. Yes.
Hi, Luke. I'm Jeff. Great talk.
Thank you.
I have a more philosophical comment and question. It has to do with the use of metaphor. Like Tom Ellis said, metaphors are like catnip, or it could be cheaper like M&Ms. But in ecology, we use balance of nature, trophic cascades, Gaia, the mother tree. Sometimes metaphors don't always map, but I thought you did a very skillful job of layering some of the complexity and not relying on one single cause and effect. So are you consciously using metaphors skillfully, or is this just a natural habit? You're doing a very good job.
Well, thank you. And I guess I just work on it because I'm a teacher, so I think about clear communication and I get a lot of practice. But as far as like not attributing everything to one particular cause, I am conscious about that because when we start oversimplifying the story, I get pushback, not usually from audiences, but from other scientists, right? So this is something that's happened in some of I think a lot of what's happened and why there's some debate about this stuff now, people are pushing back on the Yellowstone Trophic Cascades story, is because it became so popular and kind of oversimplified that, oh, wolves have fixed everything in Yellowstone. You know, it's all fully recovered and it's all because of the wolves. And so you get then people saying, hey, wait a minute. You know, like I said, my current paper says that about a third of the stands are really taken off, the aspen stands, about a third of them aren't. And then you got some in between. So it's not a complete, you know, total everything fully recovered. And also there are other factors involved like the other predators, hunters outside the park and things like that. And so I'm kind of careful about that. Yeah.
I'm Ann, and I've got the inevitable question because you were talking about managing, helping to work with the ranchers to teach them how to organize their herds better and avoid these predatory packs and
Yeah, and they don't
other
like
ways.
people telling them what to do either. Yeah.
Yeah, just teaching.
Yeah.
Well, so what's going to happen now that we've removed that population of federal employees from the management? Yeah. I'm thinking about the predators in Washington.
So the good news on that is that a lot of the management responsibility is being taken up by the state. And actually that's the goal of the Endangered Species Act, is for the federal government to oversee the recovery of a species and then to leave and let the state take it over as long as the state can keep it up. And so that's kind of where we're heading here in Oregon. Yeah, so that's the good news on that part. Yeah. Yes.
Okay. I get the last question. So, and this is John. I don't know if this is your area at all. You had the slide about the orcas and the otters.
Yeah.
So I have two questions on that. Do they have any record of what the orca population used to be? I know it's been decreasing. And then the second question is, to the extent that it has been decreasing, has the otter population been increasing up in the Puget Sound area, for example?
With the orcas in Puget Sound? Okay, those orcas do not eat mammals. The Puget Sound orcas, they're called the southern resident killer whales, they're salmon specialists. So they're doing a different thing. But these Alaskan orcas are sea lion, seal predators, and they aren't getting enough seals, so they're eating otters. In fact, one orca that was killed, I'm not sure why, but they opened it up, it had 6 sea otters in its stomach. Because, I mean, like I said, they don't have any blubber, so they're not that nutritious. So, the orcas are just like, hey, I'll pick off another one of these. And they've noticed that some of the sea otters are starting to spend more time hanging out on the beach now instead of out in the kelp bed. So that seems to also be possibly caused by some indirect effects of humans fishing on certain species, affecting the seal prey that then is reducing the seals. But that's pretty controversial, so I won't go any farther into that.
Maybe they taste like M&Ms to
Okay. So I guess that's it. That's the end of the questions.
Thank
We're
you
running
very
out of
much.
time. Let's thank Dr. Painter. Thank you very much.